If Daryl never rolled up on that highway with the Atlanta group, Rick Grimes's whole vibe today would be different. Like, we don't even realize how much that guy leaned on Daryl over the years. Rick would still be a leader, sure, because that's just who he is. But he'd probably be a lot rougher around the edges, without that quiet, loyal right-hand man backing him up. Daryl was basically the guy who took on all the wild, dangerous tasks without Rick even needing to ask twice. Rick without Daryl also means Rick would have had a lot more on his plate emotionally. Daryl was always the one who grounded him, especially after Lori, after the governor, after everything with Carl. Without that presence, Rick would have been more stressed, more paranoid, and way more likely to lose it in certain moments. He might have leaned harder into that Rick-tatorship mode just out of survival. And let's be real, Rick needed someone like Daryl to balance the group dynamics. Daryl could connect with people Rick struggled with. He brought in that bridge energy, the guy who could make Carol feel safe, who could keep the outsiders from dipping, who could go track someone down when things got messy. With no Daryl, Rick would have had way more conflict, way more people walking away, and probably more losses in the earlier seasons. Plus, Rick would have had to rely way more on characters like Shane, Glenn, or even later on Michonne, earlier than he did. But none of them filled the same space Daryl did. Shane would have pushed Rick toward violence. Glenn would have always tried to pull Rick back toward hope. And Michonne didn't fully open up until later. Rick would have been stuck bouncing between extremes for a long time. On the battlefield, Rick would still be Rick, strategic, fearless, and always rushing headfirst into danger. But without Daryl covering his blind spots, yeah, he probably would have died at least once or twice. Daryl was basically the team's clutch player. The dude saved Rick's life so many times without even making it a big deal. You take that out of the equation, and Rick has way fewer miracle escapes. Even today, modern-day Rick, whether we're talking CRM Rick, post-CRM Rick, or even just older, more worn-down Rick, would have had a totally different energy without Daryl's loyalty and brotherhood. Rick probably becomes a man who trusts less, opens up less, and carries even more guilt. He'd be tougher, colder, and a lot more isolated in his mindset. So overall, Rick without Daryl isn't weaker, but he's definitely less human. The two of them balanced each other in a way that kept Rick from becoming a full villain or burning himself out. Without Daryl, Rick would still be a survivor and a leader, but he'd be a much darker version of himself. And honestly, the whole group would have paid the price for that. And honestly, without Daryl stepping in all those times to make tough calls, Rick would have been carrying way more guilt. Think about moments like going after Sophia, hunting down Merle, chasing walkers through the woods, or even confronting weird threats before they became full problems. Daryl handled so many of those solo. Without him, Rick would have been forced to shoulder every mission personally, and that just piles on stress like crazy. Another thing is Rick's confidence. Daryl wasn't loud about it, but he supported Rick at every turn, even when Rick doubted himself. Having someone in the group who consistently had his back gave Rick the freedom to lead boldly. Without a guy like that, Rick might second-guess more decisions, or worse, hesitate at the wrong moment. And in The Walking Dead, one bad hesitation is how you end up getting bit. Plus, think about all those times Rick went off on his own, chasing answers, trying to save people, or going on little, I gotta fix everything myself missions. Daryl was always the one who either went after him or helped clean up the mess afterward. Without him, half those missions end with Rick lost, trapped, or surrounded. with nobody out there tracking him down. Daryl was basically the security system of the apocalypse. Rick's humanity also came from watching other broken men trying to do better. And Daryl was the biggest example of that. Seeing Daryl rise from a quiet, angry survivor into a loyal brother probably reminded Rick that people can change and be better. Without seeing that transformation up close, Rick might have leaned harder into the people are dangerous unless proven otherwise mindset. And let's not ignore how much Daryl influenced the group's loyalty toward Rick. When Daryl followed Rick, everyone else felt more secure doing the same. Daryl's respect acted like silent confirmation that Rick's decisions were worth trusting. Without that, the group might have cracked way earlier. People like Abraham, Sasha, even Maggie might not have aligned with Rick so easily if they didn't see someone like Daryl standing firm beside him. On the emotional side, Rick would have lost one of the few relationships where he didn't have to perform. Rick didn't have to be Sheriff Rick or Leader Rick around Daryl. He could just be himself. That's a rare bond in the apocalypse. Without it, Rick would have been more emotionally isolated, which usually leads to him making harsher, more impulsive choices. And who knows, maybe without Daryl, certain people don't survive. Carol, maybe she doesn't evolve the same way. Beth, maybe she never gets found. Merle. That whole storyline changes. Even Judith's survival might have gone differently without Daryl watching over the people Rick cared about. Daryl being gone doesn't just affect Rick, it changes the whole timeline. If we look at Rick today, especially the version we see in CRM territory, he probably carries even more emotional baggage in a world without Daryl. The loneliness hits harder, the guilt digs deeper, and the weight of every decision he's ever made feels heavier. Daryl was the one person who helped Rick make sense of the world after it broke. Without him, Rick is more likely to detach or numb himself, just to keep moving. But at the same time, Rick would still push forward, because that's who he is. He'd keep fighting for his people, keep trying to build something real, keep trying to create a world Carl would have been proud of. It just would have been a more brutal journey, with fewer moments of peace and way less trust. In the end, Rick minus Daryl is like having half a heart missing. He'd still function, he'd still survive, he'd still lead. But he'd never reach the full version of himself we saw over the years. Their bond wasn't loud or dramatic, but it shaped who Rick became. Without Daryl in the story, Rick today would be a much harder, colder, lonelier man. Still strong, but missing that one person who always reminded him he wasn't fighting alone.